les damnés de la terre, debout les forçats de la faim. La raison tonnant son cratère, c'est l'éruption de la fin. Du passé, faisons table rase, foule esclave, debout, debout. Le monde va changer de base, nous ne sommes rien, soyons tout. Pas de sauveur suprême, ni Dieu, ni César, ni tribun. Producteurs, sauvons-nous nous-mêmes, décrétons le salut commun. Pour que le vol rende gorge, pour tirer l'esprit du cachot. Soufflons nous-mêmes notre forge, battons le fer quand il est chaud. L'État comprime et la loi triche, l'impôt saigne le malheureux. Nul devoir ne s'impose aux riches, le droit du pauvre est un mot creux. C'est assez languir en tutelle, l'égalité veut d'autres lois. Pas de droit sans devoir, dit-elle, égaux, pas de devoir sans droit. Hideux dans leur apothéose, les rois de la mine et du rail ont-ils jamais fait autre chose que dévaliser le travail? Dans les coffres forts de la bande, ce qu'il a créé s'est fondu. En décrétant qu'on le lui rende, le peuple ne veut que son dû. Les rois nous saoulaient de fumée, paix entre nous, guerre aux tyrans. Appliquons la grève aux armées, crosse en l'air et rompons les rangs. S'ils s'obstinent, ces cannibales, à faire de nous des héros, ils sauront bientôt que nos balles sont pour nos propres généraux. Paysans nous sommes, le grand parti des travailleurs. La terre n'appartient qu'aux hommes, l'oisifira loger ailleurs. Combien de nos chairs se repaissent, mais si les corbeaux, les vautours, un de ces matins disparaissent, le soleil brillera toujours.
Red salute to all our comrades and friends who have joined us for today's webinar, Thank you for making time to be here and engage in some of the debates and discussions that should be unfolding today. My name is Mbali Ngwenda, and I am with Pan-Africanism Today. We are excited to begin the year of 2024 with our first online event, that being Red Books Day celebration. As we build and foster a culture of reading and writing, we say today with the slogan of each one, teach one. Within our revolutionary organizations and movements, we subsequently must build a political culture that we wish to see thrive amongst cadres and leaders of working class organizations on the African continent. Comrade, when we speak about Red Books Day, we are looking at literature that has inspired struggles and resistance to oppression in our history and our current lives. When we speak about these books, we're talking about books that were illegal, books that were banned because of the message that gave life to the working class struggle, its ideas and visions of the future. The revolutionary forces on the African continent have made it clear to advance and build socialism as a path toward the future, to specifically address the issues we face across the different regions in the struggle against international finance capital and US-led imperialism. As the youngest continent in the world, it is the minds of young Africans that are keenly sought after by various means, giving very specific images and ideas about the future world we want to see for ourselves. These images and ideas are funneled through channels such as the corporate media space, mainstream education, and having a strong hold on culture and mainstream politics. Comrade, we need to ask ourselves, are we doing enough to build a counter-hegemony to this onslaught on the minds of African youth? When 52% of young Africans between the age of 18 and 24 are looking to leave the continent and never look back, what alternative visions and images are we propagating of Africa's future? Are we doing justice to African revolutionary literature and history today? The same history, the same literature that is sidelined and demonized in critical discussions. Are we sharpening the lens by which we must view our current struggle and resistance to neocolonialism? Comrades, we are agents of change and transformation, and we can never tolerate being called criminals when we advance the revolutionary line of the working class and peasantry. Comrades, today we continue to stand in solidarity with Prabir Purshkayata, the founder and editor-in-chief of NewsClick, a vibrant digital media outlet and media alternative for popular struggles throughout the world. Comrade Prabir has been detained for being India's fiercest and most uncompromising defender of people's struggles, for speaking about the big story behind seemingly separate political events. The Indian government has kept him in a Delhi prison complex since late 2023 till today. Comrade, we stand in firm solidarity and resistance against repressive right-wing governments. Comrade, we also stand in firm solidarity with the Palestinian people and their spirit of resistance to the current genocide they have been subjected to. The bloodthirsty Israeli government and its warlords continue to expand their military operations into Gaza, more specifically into the southern city of Rafah, even after the International Court of Justice has ordered the Israeli government to take all measures within its power to refrain and prevent the commission of all acts within the scope of Article 2 of the Genocide Convention of 1948. We still see massive attacks on Palestinian cultural institutions, artworks, and theaters. We continue to see the assassination and deliberate killing of journalists till today. We say to the Palestinian people that their struggle is one of pure resistance, and it is a struggle that will force the world to think again about what it means to be a human being in the 21st century. Comrade, political and ideological education is a tool to combat the capitalist system, including the poverty and the suffering that it looks to normalize and deem as natural law. Its ideas, its images, its so-called modernization, its economy, these things that look to divide the working class on the continent and have us struggle separately rather than as a united force. Comrades and leaders of popular struggles on the continent, please allow me to welcome our speakers for today's Red Books Day celebration, Comrade Blaise Tulo from the Socialist Movement of Ghana and Comrade Kiritu Chenge from the Communist Party of Kenya. Welcome, comrades, and we are truly honored to have you on this platform. Comrades, without wasting too much time, I would like for us to shift to Comrade Kiritu, who has chosen the book called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. He's chosen it to center his discussion and his engagement. Comrade Kiritu, the floor is yours, comrade.
Thank you, Comrade Mbali, for the introduction and for reminding us of the struggles that we currently face as young people in the African continent. I think it is very important to be highly aware of the actions that hegemons are taking currently all across the world. I am currently in Kenya, and right now there is actually something underway being directed by the United States. Kenya is being employed by the United States to send soldiers and police officers to Haiti. And as a comrade from Kenya, I would like to fervently rebuke such kind of actions being taken against our brothers and sisters, against our comrades in Haiti. And I think that fittingly, and I had seen a notification that apparently the government of Haiti, the current comprador class of Haiti, has come to an agreement today with Kenya on the day in which soldiers can be sent to Haiti. And I think then it's fitting that I chose Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, precisely because this is one of the things that Walter Rodney had talked about as to how actually the downfall of the African continent had been brought about. And in his book, Walter Rodney had specifically talked about the responsibility that was incumbent on us as African people. In fact, when people sometimes might hear without having read the book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, one of the things that might come to their mind is, oh, this is just a way for African people to excuse themselves from not being developed, from being underdeveloped and all of that. But in fact, what Walter Rodney specifically did was to tell the African masses, this specific reasons are why the African continent is underdeveloped. So it is incumbent on us as African people to take this knowledge and use it now to change the conditions that are keeping us underdeveloped. So the first thing that Walter Rodney did, specifically achieved with his book, is open up the minds of African people and Africa and the African diaspora or all across the world to the real struggle and the direction that we need to take to actually resist Western hegemony, which is currently plaguing us in this day and age. So I'd just like to start off now, having been on the subject, and first of all, talk about one of the things that I specifically love about how Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa is illustrate what the ways of disintegration of community amongst African people. One of the things he said is basically, he highlights a proverb that for somebody in Cotonou to speak to somebody in Accra, the person in Cotonou would have to reach out to Paris so that the Paris can connect them to London, so that London can connect them to Accra. And that essentially illustrates the kind of disconnection that has been brought about on the African continent, whereby each and every single African country is tied to their masters, so per se. And those masters are now facilitating their role as middlemen. And that middleman kind of role that Europe has given itself is one of the ways in which Africa has been underdeveloped. Specifically, he talks about how to actually foster the kind of science, technology, markets that would be required to now foster innovation and invention. You require actually large systems of integration, essentially a superstructure, if you will. However, that in itself has been disabled with this disconnect that has been created on the African continent. So there isn't enough conglomeration and there isn't enough a coming together of resources that can facilitate that kind of innovation and invention. So that is one of the things that I love specifically about Walter Rodney's book on how Europe underdeveloped Africa. Up to Walter's time, Walter was a man that was born from Guyana. And in the Caribbean, they had been specifically been made aware of the fact that they as a people are underdeveloped because one, they are Black, and two, they are descendants of the African continent. So Walter Rodney knew full well that to restore the dignity of Black people all across the world, the dignity of the African continent itself had to be restored. So what he set about to do is correct the history of the African continent and the various forms of revisionism that had come about. What he identified was essentially twofold. One, capitalism, and two, imperialism as the ultimate stage of capitalism. He points out that imperialism is what actually bred what we see today as white racism, the structure that essentially affirmed the notion that not only is capital going to be invested on the African continent, but the control of that capital has to lie in the hands of the European or the white person. So that is what the mission that Walter Rodney had set out for himself, to correct the narratives of how exactly Africa ended up where we are today. He divided this into two parts: Africa between 1500 and 1900, and Africa between 1900 to 1960. And the last part is where he touched on neocolonialism, which is Africa post-1960 and post-colonial, and in a post-colonial setting. And one of the things, that he was able to do is illustrate the various ways Africans responded to the kind of machinations that were being deployed by the Europeans between 1500 to 1900. And he illustrates very well that what the Europeans had succeeded in doing the most was economic capture. And that was specifically what led up to and deteriorated Africa to such an extent that by 1900, it was ripe for the taking by the European powers. He also points out that the mission of colonialism indeed was political, but there was capital infused into the heart of it. In as much as the European had come in and carved out political divisions in which France owned this specific part of Africa and Britain owned this other specific part of Africa, capital did not confine itself to, as the economic sense, did not confine itself to those political boundaries. You see, Portugal in Angola and Mozambique had invited other European capital powers to come and invest and play a part in these specific countries during colonialism. We see when Leopold had carved out the Congo Free State, the biggest problem that the Europeans had with Leopold was not the atrocities when King I'm forgetting the name, but when the king, I think it was Trudeau, Agaja Trudeau, had come into power in Dahomey, then he himself sought out to actually eradicate the whole institution of slavery, noting how dehumanizing it had been not only on the people of Dahomey, but on the other neighboring countries, as in relations to how Europeans had been engaging with these countries. So he sought out to ban the forts of slavery on the coast. However, after he had succeeded in doing so, he realized that there was still a need to engage in trade for firearms and whatnot with the European continent, but he wanted to do so from a point of healthy trade and healthy relations. However, because other kingdoms and states around him were still engaging in the slave trade, there was an inability to exert that kind of pressure that would force these European entities to change their ways and decide we want to engage in a healthy trade relationship with you. That is the kind of problems that we are faced with today. Right now, we are seeing in West Africa, we have the states of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger that have decided it is upon them to actually kick out the French and kick out all of these imperial powers. However, they are in a state of isolation, and the rest of West Africa is very much engaged in a process of trying to undermine the kind of revolutionary steps that are being taken in Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. Therefore, this reminds us of one thing, and this was what one of the things that Walter Rodney was trying to communicate in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. We cannot do this as isolated entities on the African continent. In order for real change to occur on the African continent, it has to be a group effort. There has to be a coming together from South Africa to Algeria, from Somalia to Senegal, and all the way into the heart of DR Congo. Right now, there is a genocide that is happening in DR Congo that is being perpetuated by Rwanda, by President Kagame, in concert with countries like the United States and the European Union. And we can see that the people of Congo are becoming more aware. They burnt down the embassy of France just the other day. They have been protesting against the embassies of the United States. They have been protesting against action that the UN is taking within its borders, within its boundaries. And they have been doing so in efforts of saying, we are aware of what President Kagame is doing, but we are also aware that there are backers of President Kagame that are enabling him to carry out the genocide in DR Congo. However, this also reminds us that the struggle in Congo is our struggle. Nelson Mandela himself also said that the struggle in Palestine is the struggle of South Africa, and the end to apartheid could not be considered as complete without the liberation of Palestine. That kind of cross movement and cross solidarity is what is needed in this day and age, and that is what Walter Rodney's book reminds us. So just getting to some of the details that he maybe had illustrated in his book. First, he talked about the developmental conditions that have been playing out on the African continent. So one of the things perhaps that we tend to forget is that the stages of development do not necessarily play out the same from continent to continent. In Europe, Karl Marx had identified that the stages of development were communal to slavery, to serfdom, to capitalism. But he also identified that the stages of development in Asia did not directly correspond to how Europe had developed, that there was a disconnect in how Asia had been developing. It did not necessarily follow the linear line that Europe had developed. On the African continent, what Walter Rodney identified is that the stages of development were necessarily communal to serfdom, without necessarily a stage of slavery in between. And he also identified that the conditions of slavery that had risen out of Europe were due to the decay and the degradation of communalism within Europe. The same did not apply to Africa. Slavery was usually as a result of outside forces. So when slavery arose on the West African coast from Senegal to Angola, that was as a result of external demand. That was not as a result of internal demand. That's one of the things that Walter Rodney had identified. He also identified that there were areas in which serfdom, most of the African continent was in a transition stage between communalism and serfdom, and that there were places where serfdom had become actualized. For example, in what he calls the interlacustrine region, that is the Great Lakes region around Uganda, Burundi, Rwanda, and northern Tanzania. And what he identifies then is that there was indeed a process of development. There was indeed a process of change, but that change itself on the African continent was a bit slow. The reason for it being slow was that change is as a result of intense contradictions. The contradictions that were present in Europe was so fierce in regards to serfdom that a new economic system had to arise, and that was capitalism. Those tensions and contradictions were a bit slower were less intense on the African continent. Therefore, the change was necessarily gradual. However, the change from, for example, communalism to serfdom in various regions of the African continent where serfdom had actualized were evidently non-violent because of that non-intensity of contradictions. What we do see today is that there are intense contradictions as a result of colonialism and the neo-colonial struggle that we face today. And so what I do believe is that we as comrades all across the continent have to ready ourselves, because the contradictions themselves are very intense. And the intensity of those contradictions are very much enlightening the masses, making them aware that there is a problem on the African continent and something needs to change, and something needs to change fast. But that can be easily taken advantage of. And we see it all across social media. We see it all across the conversations that we have with people. The intensity of contradictions as a result of capitalism are engaging people to actually think, oh, what are the alternatives that we can pursue? And that leaves room for hijacking. And the hijacking itself comes as a result of fascism, which presents false solutions on the African continent. And that is something that we need to be aware of and try to constantly fight as comrades. He also talked about several things actually, but I think I've highlighted a lot of things that he talked about. One thing he did talk about is one of these conspiracy theories that colonialism wasn't necessarily profitable, as well as, let's say, the pre-colonial conditions of trade between Europe and Africa weren't necessarily profitable. But it is very evident that the kind of profit that was generated on the African continent as a result of the slave trade and as a result of colonialism, one, enabled the industrialization that happened. One of the things that Walter Rodney came in and said in actually one of the very first pages is that the very act of making tools was a stimulus to increase rationality rather than the consequence of a full intellect. Tools as a form of liberation from physical necessity are themselves help to increase mental engagement. So what that means necessarily is that it is the tools that you develop that help you to free yourself and to be able to expand your scope. Under capitalism that Europe employs as a tool, that in itself enable them to expand and develop room for innovation and invention. And where were they able to develop capital? That tool that enabled them to now expand their innovation and invention. that was developed through engagement and exploitation of the African continent. It is as a result of capital accumulation that innovation and invention was enabled on the European front. And that is something that we have to remember, that if we take away this fact, we can take away the fact that had that capital actually remained on the African continent, all of the invention and innovation that we do see on the European continent will have enabled a transformation of the African continent. The other thing that Walter Rodney talks about, and this is towards the end of his book, I'm highlighting different parts of the book because a lot of it is very fascinating and a lot of it is very eye-opening. So it's hard to just stick to one part. But one of the things that he specifically talks about is education. And now that speaks to another conspiracy theory that he was able to actually debunk. The conspiracy theory that actually there was a civilizing mission on the African continent, that Europe actually came and developed the African continent. He does note that actually capitalism was not actually created on the African continent. The fact is that Europeans wouldn't have necessarily come to create capitalists on the African continent, because that would have itself resulted in competition. And we see that up to this day. The kind of austerity measures, the Washington Consensus that is used by the IMF and World Bank to determine how loans are given to the African continent itself show the kind of restrictions that are placed to ensure that capital, for example, or capitalists does not evolve on the African continent. Now, he talks about education, and he talks about the fact that even when it comes to education, the education itself was very poor in terms of like what the colonialists were able to inculcate on the African continent. Only 65 graduates were emerged out of the colonialism of the Congo. 65 graduates out of a nation of millions. Only 65 graduates were able to emerge. And that itself exposes the fallacy that Europeans somehow developed Africa, because they did not. He talks about how even the kind of education itself that was promoted on the African continent, it was very much geared towards enabling Africans to hate themselves and tie themselves to European identity. And that in itself is a form of regression. He highlights an example of, I'm forgetting the community, but he highlights an example of somebody whose community had a wealth of information of various tree species, around 65 tree species that children were taught from an early age to know. But when a specific person from this community was sent to school, to a mission school, he was taught about different species of flowers. And when he came back to his community, he felt like he was alienated because he had nothing to offer. He had nothing to offer in the way of education, because what he knew was different species of flowers, not necessarily different tree species, which would have enabled a scientific improvement of agricultural techniques on the African continent. I do not know if my time is up, but one of the last things I will say is that this actually leads us to think, okay, well, what is this? What economic pursuits should we have if we are indeed able to free ourselves from hegemonic control by Western powers? Then automatically one would think that, oh, that means that we have to develop capitalism on the African continent. But already Walter Rodney reminds us that through the analysis that Marx had provided on the European continent, it was very clear and very evident that capitalism in itself was not the solution, because the workers themselves and the kind of proletariat that had been developed in Europe was evidence enough that capitalism generates suffering. Therefore, here on the African continent, we have to realize that it is not a linear form of progression. Like I had already highlighted earlier what Walter Rodney had talked about, we did not follow the linear progression of communalism to slavery to serfdom to capitalism. Instead, ours was communalism to serfdom, right? So we do not necessarily have to say that the path to socialism and communism is through capitalism. That's one thing that, for example, we have to remind ourselves, that we don't necessarily have to follow a linear line. What we do have to do is look at the material conditions on the African continent and see how we can engage that and use that to improve ourselves. And the material conditions on the African continent call for a revolution, an actual revolution that does away with the domination by capital and instead asserts labor as the primary, as the primary driving force of production on the African continent. Labor has been exploited for a long period of time on the African continent. Intellectual labor, physical labor, all forms of labor on the African continent have been exploited. Right now, the government of Kenya is seeking to export nurses and doctors to the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia on the basis that we have generated a surplus of graduates. And it's funny because Walter Rodney actually highlights this specific thing in his book by saying that even on the, he highlights he highlights the fact that in a lot of places, for example, in Ghana, the number of graduates that produced were a surplus as opposed to the estimates that the Europeans had wanted to generate out of Ghana. And that shows that the economic system itself is unable to integrate the kind of graduates and the kind of intellect that is being generated on the African continent. That itself shows that the system itself right now needs to change. And that means that we need to have an appreciation of ourselves as African people. We need to ground ourselves in history. And we need to do that remembering that we do have history and we do indeed have a path for development. Yeah, so with that, I think I am done. I will just I'll just finalize within my five minutes, but I hope you see why I love Walter Rodney's book on how Europe underdeveloped Africa.
Thank you so much, Comrade Kiritu. And we are saying today on Red Books Day, each one teach one. This is exactly why we are hosting this webinar. And I think anyone who has been listening, Comrade, has gotten a lot from what you have said. I think let us say this, that there is a genocide happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo. There is a genocide happening there, and we will not shed a blind eye to it. I think, Comrade, you have shown us a very clear picture of how colonialism and neocolonialism operates. And I think one of the things we must look at is the question of the debt, the element of debt that neoliberal governments are in, the permanent debt servicing that we are in, perhaps is also another form of this neo-colonial trap we find ourselves in. Thank you so much, Comrade Kiritu. But now to swiftly move on to Comrade Blaise Tulo of the Socialist Movement of Ghana, who has chosen a book called The Great Deception to center his discussion today. I would like to open the floor to your self-leadership. Comrade Blaise, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, comrades. I'd like to pay particular attention to the fact that Pan-Africanism today have done a very good work by bringing all of us together on an important day such as Red Books Day. Red Books Day has become a very important day for all progressives to engage in ideas of liberation, which has been one of the cornerstones of our activism over the last decades. One thing that strikes me is that we in Ghana are commemorating the 58th year after the overthrow of Nkrumah on the 24th of February. And there is a clear nexus that I can draw between the 21st Red Books Day and the 24th of February that we Ghanaians are going to commemorate. Because what we are commemorating on the 24th is actually a day in which right-wing reactionary elements led by the United States of America overthrew the progressive government of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. And one of the reasons why they overthrew Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, and I'm going to pay a lot of attention to it when I discuss the book, The Great Deception, is that Nkrumah was making the African region too politically conscious. And why I say that there's a nexus is because Red Books Day is actually meant to draw consciousness, to reconnect the ideas of liberation and how these ideas of liberation can help us forge, a path that resonates with the working people of the world. Now, what we are going to be launching on the 24th is the 4th edition of The Great Deception. Now, there are people who have asked, why the 4th edition? So it means that there's been the 1st edition, there's been the 2nd, 3rd, and this is the 4th. We are relaunching The Great Deception because books are life, okay? Books have an organic connection with the people. Books don't die. Books are a reflection of the concrete realities of the people. So for us, it is important to relaunch The Great Deception in order to draw home that the events of the 24th of February 1966 are still relevant to us today. The crisis, the economic and political crisis that the Ghanaian society is in today, and by extension, the African region, are partly because of the events of the 24th of February. So I think that it is very relevant for us to re-engage with the book, and that's why we decided to choose The Great Deception as our center of focus for this discussion. Now, books have got authors, and my comrade mentioned the author of How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Walter Rodney. Now, who are the authors of The Great Deception? It's very important. Now, there are overt and covert authors of The Great Deception. They are overt authors because this is actually a compilation of the classified documents of the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States of America. They are the authors of this book. Because what the Socialist Movement of Ghana did in its 1st edition is to just pile all these documents and publish them. So we just facilitated it, but really the authors of this book are the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States of America. And what did they do? What is the importance of this book? Comrades and friends, you see, the crisis that we are in today as a continent are not by accident. There have been deliberate, methodic, and systematic actions by the United States of America and its Western allies to undermine the development paradigm of the African continent. When Ghana gained independence in 1957, Nkrumah charted the path for the liberation of the Ghanaian people. But Nkrumah understood, and there were 2 important statements that he made at independence, that the independence of Ghana was meaningless until it was connected to the total liberation of the African continent. And we must know that the flag independence of the African continent was political. It was not economic. The levers of imperialism, the levers of colonialism were still entrenched in our continent. The forces of backwardness, the forces of oppression and exploitation were still present. So they were not happy with this comment that was made by Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. And they went all out to make sure that they undermined his regime and to make him unpopular and to eventually overthrow his government. And comrades, it is clear, if you read this book, there were conversations by the CIA together with Mahoney, who was the American ambassador in Ghana, discussing the political atmosphere in Ghana. The United States of America was very worried that the US was becoming unpopular. Don't forget, 2 to 3 years into the regime of Nkrumah, 22 attempts were made to assassinate him. And the Ghanaian people were worried. It was widely publicized in the media that the US was involved in the attempt to assassinate Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. So the US was worried that its capital, its interest in Ghana was going to be undermined by this widespread rumor that they were involved in the attempted assassination of Nkrumah. So what did they do? They sent cables. They sent the ambassador to go and meet Nkrumah and to discuss with him that, look, they were greatly worried about the atmosphere. In fact, there were a lot of the right-wing reactionary elements have thrown out into the public space that Nkrumah was so unpopular. It's not true. This book reveals that there were spots of demonstrations in front of the embassy of the United States of America. Yesterday, we discussed the crisis that is happening in the DRC. We know that there are a lot of demonstrations happening at the forecourt of the embassy of the United States of America. The US was very worried about those demonstrations. In fact, the Nkrumah government had picked up signals that 6 professors at the University of Ghana were playing a key role in undermining his regime. So those professors were sacked from the university. So all this created a climate of hostility by the United States of America on the government of Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. So they sent their ambassador to go and have discussions with him that, look, the US was very worried. Kwame Nkrumah wrote a Kennedy wrote back, and those letters are all contained in this book. Kennedy wrote back to Nkrumah, reassuring Nkrumah that there was no attempt whatsoever to assassinate him or to undermine his regime, and that they were going to do all what they could to ensure that they foster a very good relationship with the Nkrumah regime and the people of Ghana to foster the needs and aspirations of the Ghanaian people. And comrades, I think this is where the trust of the matter is. Today, we hold the US, when I say we, of course, not us, right-wing reactionary elements hold the United States of America as the beacon of democracy. They hold the United States of America as the protector of the rights and freedoms of people of the world. The US is now the standard of defending the sovereignty of countries. This book reveals in detail, and this is not reporting, these are the CIA declassified documents telling you how the United States of America, the president, the ambassador, sat down and deliberately plot to undermine a government, a popular government, a progressive government that was duly elected by the people of Ghana. And today, we cannot say that that thing happened in 1966. We know that today, the US is continuously involved in undermining regimes. The instability that is happening in DRC, the US is greatly involved. We know very well that the coup d'etats that have happened in the Sahel were mostly a reaction or a protest against the US dominance. People think that it is France. Of course, yes, it is France imperialism, but behind France is the backing of the United States of America. We know what they have done in Afghanistan, in Syria. So let us throw this bogus argument once and for all. The US can never be the standard of democracy. And we have to make this point with all the strength that we can. So here is the US president writing back to Nkrumah, ensuring him that there was no plot to overthrow his government. Meanwhile, they were behind the scene, instigating, plotting, having meetings, sending telegrams, machinating in order to ensure that they overthrow his regime. The other critical point that is important to draw home is that the United States of America didn't do this alone. They did it with local lackeys, the lackeys who think that they serve the interests of Western powers. And that is where the class question is key. The class question is key. That look, we see all these our leaders, they dress like us, they eat the same food as we do. We see them every day on the campaign trail, talking all the beautiful language that we can think about, but we do not have the same class as them. In fact, the Great Deception reveals that the Dankwa bourgeois tradition, who are today in power in Ghana, the leaders were in the payroll of the CIA. So when Dankwa came out from prison, he wrote to the US telling them why their pay had been reduced by some amount. So the United States of America were paying people in Ghana in order to help, the overthrow of Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. We also know that when Patrice Lumumba was assassinated, that was one of the major events, the crisis in DRC. Patrice Lumumba, where Nkrumah was very concerned about the DRC. And Nkrumah paid a lot of attention on Patrice Lumumba. So when Patrice Lumumba was assassinated, Nkrumah was deeply worried about the trend. Nkrumah was championing the Pan-African project. Nkrumah was championing the continental unity of the African continent. One standing army, one bank, one continental government that will forward the wishes and aspirations of the African people. And we know that there were a lot of resistance, even by some of the leaders of the African continent. So when Patrice Lumumba was assassinated, Nkrumah saw the nexus. He was worried, and he made a very sterling speech, drawing home that the US was involved in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. The US was worried, wrote letters, all of them are contained in the book, telling Nkrumah that Nkrumah was still continuing his agenda to make the US unpopular, and vowed that they never had a hand in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. One other event that worried the US so much that made them conclude that, look, Nkrumah is our adversary, we must get rid of him, was this book, Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. This book was first published in 1965. Nkrumah was overthrown in 1966. When this book was published, the declassified document says it all, that the US panicked. In fact, some of the resources, the aid that they had promised the Nkrumah regime, they immediately cut it. And they concluded that, look, it was time to overthrow the Kwame Nkrumah regime. The other important point to make is that you remember at that time, that was also the advent of the Cold War. The US was at war in Vietnam, and Nkrumah wanted to go to Vietnam to mediate that conflict. Before Nkrumah left, he sent a very important letter to the President of the United States of America. That time it was Johnson. And what did he say? He says that, look, I am about to take a trip to Hanoi, but I have received indications that this was what the CIA were doing, that there were he had heard about some gunshots somewhere, and Nkrumah was worried that his departure from Ghana at that moment would have created the space for the US and the CIA to overthrow him. The US again responded that there were no basis for those concerns that Nkrumah had raised. In fact, the US said that they were very, very happy that a leader of the African continent was playing a mediation role in the war in Vietnam. And that showed that the African had reached a state where they could steer their own affairs and that they could play a leading role in international politics. Again, I mean, we must also give it to Nkrumah. I think Nkrumah was an exceptionally nice man. For all the signals that Nkrumah had picked, Nkrumah thought that there was a possibility to find his way through imperialism, which must confirm what my comrade was talking about. Imperialism has no permanent friends. And we must take a cue from the Nkrumah experience. So Nkrumah was assured that his trip to Hanoi, his trip to Vietnam was a worthy trip, and that they were giving him all the backing that they could. And when he left to Hanoi, his government was overthrown. So first of all, I think that we must clear the facts. Whatever the US tells you is not true. And it is very clear with the Nkrumah experience. Today, we are having right-wing governments in power. Today, neo-colonial lackeys are controlling the state machinery. That space only became possible because of the US role in getting rid of leaders like Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, Salvador Allende in Chile, and so many of them. So today, we cannot be naive. We need to call out the United States of America for who they are. They have no interest in the African region. We have to know that it is about class. We need to organize our people around the role that the United States of America is playing in our region. There is a very important document that has been released by Tricontinental called Hyper-Imperialism. That spots all the military bases that the US has and the control that the US still exerts on our leaders. So we should not be oblivious of that. We also know that recently, and my comrade did mention it, 3 countries in the Sahel have attempted, in fact, they have broken away from ECOWAS. All these sub-regional bodies, ECOWAS, SADC, were the anti-Nkrumah elements against the Pan-African Continental Unity Project that Nkrumah spoke about. Nkrumah never wanted these regional bodies because these regional bodies like SADC and ECOWAS were neo-colonial projects to divide the African continent, to tell you that, look, the experience in the southern sector of Africa is different from the experiences of West Africa. It's not true. We have all gone through a peculiar political experience of colonialism and neo-colonialism. The only way we can combat and defeat it is a certain unity. And that's why we are exceptionally happy about this position that has been taken by these 3 countries in the Sahel. We don't know what it will lead to, but it's giving us signs of the people's resistance to the US control and to the control of the West. The other important point that I want to make is to also draw a certain connection between our political struggles and our economic struggles. Nkrumah won the political struggle. Nkrumah came to power and said that, look, political victory was just a prelude to our economic emancipation. We must address the concrete conditions that affects our African people. Our people are desperate. We have no option than to organize our people. And that is why an emphasis on the politics of our movements and our organizations are critical. Today, right-wing regimes are in power in Ghana, but celebrating the Day of Shame is important for us. Commemorating 21st of February as Red Books Day are important political struggles. We must win over the political struggles in order to entrench and to advance the economic struggles. The economic struggles are important, but they only come after we have won the political struggles. And that is why we are impressed about the resurgence of left-wing parties, communist parties, progressive movements, women's organizations, youth movements, the trade unions. All of them are coming together under an umbrella of anti-imperialist struggles, which is meant to draw home that the events of the 24th of February 1966 that overthrew Osagefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah should not happen again in the history of the African continent. The history of that event is important. We cannot forget about it. We can't forget our history. We can't forget Patrice Lumumba. We can't forget what is happening in DRC. We cannot forget the experience of Thomas Sankara. And discussions like this create the platform that allows us to drive home that, look, imperialism will certainly be defeated. And it will be defeated only when we come together as people's movement in order to chart our common path. I'd like to conclude by drawing home or drawing highlights of what is going to happen in Ghana on the 24th of February. We are going to launch the book. We are inviting Professor Comrade Vijay Prashad, who is the executive director of Tricontinental, to come and launch the book for us. I mean, he's a huge figure. The project in which he leads, Tricontinental, has been very key in producing research, materials, books that are liberating. And we think that having a personality like himself will be very important in driving home the point against imperialism, but also projecting that, look, ideas and books of liberation are still important in the 21st century. We're also going to have one of our most distinguished comrade, Equia Brichum, who is a staunch feminist, who is also a trade unionist, who will be present to review this book. And we're going to have Dr. Yao Graham of Third World Network, who will chair the event. We call on all of you to join us on the 24th in whichever way you can, to make sure that we drive home the point that what happened to the Nkrumah regime has a direct connection to what is happening in West Africa. And the only way that we can combat imperialism is when we come together, when we develop an understanding of our conjuncture in order to develop a program and a line of action that will end up defeating neocolonialism and all the vestiges of imperialism. Thank you very much, and raise salute and happy Red Books Day to you all.
Thank you so much, Comrade Blaise, and a happy Red Books, comrades. We hope you are enjoying this so far. Comrade Blaise, just to echo what you said, books do not age, books do not die. In fact, books give us life. And this is what we are celebrating here. And I think you have given us so much, even if it's such a short period of time, leadership, but you've given us so much to capture on. Perhaps really, the Great Deception has uncovered the real face of terror, the real face of regime change. And perhaps the Great Deception has given us an idea as to how critically we need to think when we discuss the question of political sovereignty, when we are going forward in these discussions. What do we mean? Perhaps the Great Deception is giving us an idea as to what extent US-led imperialism would go to make sure that they have some kind of a government or state which jumps at a whim whenever they make a request. Thank you so much, Comrade Blaise, for that. Comrades, I know we are coming towards the tail end of our discussion, but I want to give just 5 minutes to yourself, Comrade Kiritu, and then yourself, Comrade Blaise, just to give us your closing remarks on this day. And then I think then we will be coming to a conclusion. But comrades, please, just 5 minutes of what you would like who is listening to us now, what you would like for them to really take home and really reflect on going forward. Comrade Kiritu, let's start with yourself, Comrade.
Thank you. Just alert me as to when my 5 minutes are up. But to start off my closing remarks, I'd like to highlight something that Walter Rodney talked about towards the tail end of his book, which was what exactly makes conscious activity? What exactly defines the ability to make history? And what he talked about was that conscious activity is the ability to grapple with the heritage of objective material conditions and social relations. That is what makes conscious activity, because the way we engage with our environment is what enables us to think at a higher level. It is the material conditions around us that determine what exactly we do and how exactly we relate with it. That's one of the important things I'd like all of us to take away today. As to the whole matter at hand of what the real problem facing us is, we have a problem of neo-colonial cadres. And that is as a direct result of colonialism. When the British in Kenya were handing over power as a result of the war that was fought by the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, which is otherwise known as the Mau Mau. When they were handing over power, they did not hand it over to these revolutionary groups. Instead, what they did is hand it over to these colonial cadres. These are elements that had been educated under the colonial system. Elements such as Jomo Kenyatta, who had firmly grasped what the British wanted and how exactly they wanted the direction of Kenya to go in. And that is exactly what they did. Today, the people who had struggled so fervently for the independence here in Kenya, that is the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, languish in poverty. They languish in being ignored from mainstream media and whatnot. Whereas the sons and daughters of colonial chiefs who are educated in the ways of the white man are the ones who are in power today. And they're reflected in our current regime of the comprador, William Ruto, and his deputy, Rigathi Gachagua. But what we also need to remember is that flag independence, or like political sovereignty, is not in itself an insignificant achievement. It is something that we should take pride in. The fact that the political sovereignty was hijacked is not itself taking away credit from the fact that we did achieve political independence, because one of the things it did is that it narrowed the proximity to power between the people and those who are in power in the country. And that is very important, because the moment we overthrow the regimes that are collaborating with the United States and Europe, that is it. We shall have gained our own autonomy. I also think that we need to remind ourselves that the situation is not hopeless. Even though it might feel hopeless, what we are doing right now here with the engagement of certain revolutionary literature is in itself a way of keeping ourselves conscious. On March, the Communist Party of Kenya is going to have a pass-out parade whereby new cadres will be integrated into the party. And I will hope and pray that we will be able to continue expanding our activities as the Communist Party and as other revolutionary groups in Kenya. By doing so, I would also encourage all of us to continue organizing and to continue engaging, grounding ourselves with such revolutionary material, because it reminds us that we're not crazy. This is stuff that is actually real. There are scholarly articles, there are scholarly books, there are works that have been grounded in academic circles and in theory that themselves speak to the reality of the conditions that we are in today. That means that when, for example, my comrade has talked about the Great Deception, Speaking of when telling somebody, you know, the kind of coups that have been happening on the African continent, there are as a result of direct interference from the CIA and the United States. That in itself is not a conspiracy because they themselves have documented their own activities. And it's important then to realize that in order to combat this kind of reactionary elements, we need to remind ourselves what is real history, what is the real situation on the ground. And that's why I'm very much grateful for such kind of platforms as Red Books Day. It is important for us to remember that the fight is political and the fight is economic. The fight is also sociocultural. Right now, for example, there are efforts to pass anti-queer legislation in Kenya. There are efforts to pass anti-queer legislation in Ghana. Here in Kenya, that effort to pass anti-queer legislation has curiously come in coincidence with the sending of troops to Haiti. That in itself is very important because it reminds us that on the sociocultural front, reactionary elements are meant as a way to obfuscate the kind of exploitative actions that are taken on the masses. So it's important to remember that an all-round approach is always best when facing these kinds of problems. Let's read, let's organize, let's educate, and let's liberate so that we can celebrate. Thank you.
Comrade Blaise, I think you can jump in, leadership.
Oh, just a short one. You know, there's a very short article that's been put together by our comrades in Brazil from the MST. It is called The Comrade Who Didn't Like to Read. It's a very short article, but very instructive. And I'll encourage all of us to try and get it and then read it. It's a very short article. But a central theme of that article is that not just that reading is very important for struggle, but that all of us have the capacity to read. You know, because we don't have to disintegrate ourselves around here. Some people think, oh, look, I don't have the capacity to read, because then I cannot reproduce verbatim whatever I have read. But engaging in texts that have got a historical antecedent that is connected to the struggles of the people is very, very liberating. On a day like this, Red Books Day, it is important to remind ourselves that reading is very important, that we must read, we must learn to read together, have discussions among ourselves so that we can develop that connection that is important to forge our struggle forward. The second thing I want to say is that, look, it is only in conditions of struggle, only when can we forge that path that is consistent with the needs and aspirations of our people. We go into our communities, we know that the material conditions of our people in the communities. We need to organize. And we can only organize if we have a better understanding and appreciation of the situation. And that is why on a day like this, I'd like to encourage all of us. I'd like to thank Pan-Africanism today for this very bold initiative. We should do this more. We should learn together, because the task that we have at hand is a very, very serious one. Imperialism and colonialism, the enemies don't go to sleep. They are constantly working. They have all the resources at their disposal. Perhaps the only thing that we have is the support and the masses, and then our collective discipline. And if we put these two together, I can assure all of us that victory is certain. We're already seeing signs of the work that has been done in the last decade. We cannot afford to lose guard. And I'm happy that we are having this conversation. I'm happy about the text that we have engaged in today. How Europe underdeveloped Africa, the Great Deception, how the CIA was involved in overthrowing the progressive regime of Asajifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, and by extension, all the progressive regimes that has been overthrown in the past. How do we recreate those revolutionary moments? How do we engage with the past in order to forge the path going forward? And we can see the results already. Let's continue to discuss, let's continue to study together, and victory is certain. Red salute to all of you, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Comrade Blaise. Thank you so much, Comrade Kiritu. And thank you to everyone who has joined us on this celebration, whereby we are saying each one teach one. And we must say in closing to all of our comrades on the continent, leaders of organizations at all levels, organizers, shop stewards, informal workers, popular and militant educators. Let us remember Samora Machel, a socialist coming from the Marxist-Leninist tradition. When he spoke of militancy, he said, "The militant is he or she who lives the worries of the organization and who, through the creative application of our line of thought in the detail of everyday life, becomes a model servant of people for everyone, the builder of a new society. The task entrusted to him or her is carried out with the sense that its objective is to serve the people. And in receiving his or her mission from the people, he or she consecrates everything to them, including his own life." Comrades, thank you again for joining us. Hopefully we can continue these discussions, be it on this platform or where we find each other, be it on the field, in the office, where we are organizing. Let's not let these conversations end here. Thank you so much, comrades, for joining us. And hopefully we can continue doing this. Thank you, comrades.